Digital Foundry is sponsored by Backface, the leader in crash and error reporting for game developers. Click on the link in the video description and sign up for your free trial today.
Sports games, not something we typically cover here on Digital Foundry, but with NBA 2K21 on the new consoles, well, we felt it was worth a look. After all, in many ways, sports games tend to stand out as great launch titles showcasing the capabilities of the hardware, and 2K21 is no exception. Now, developer Visual Concepts is certainly no stranger to this either, having made a name for itself with the NFL and NBA 2K series on Sega Dreamcast, and it has continued to grow the NBA 2K series ever since. With 2K21, the team has delivered a surprisingly ambitious next-gen upgrade with some new features and greatly enhanced visuals. So, on today's video, we'll explore those new visuals while drawing comparisons with the last generation versions of the game. We'll also check out how it compares on the new consoles while discussing performance. Ready? Let's jam! Alright, let's start with the caveat here. When it comes to basketball games, my knowledge mostly begins and ends with NBA Jam, so we're gonna mostly stick with discussing visuals here. It's difficult to appreciate gameplay changes as a basketball layman after all. Still, there is a reason I wanted to talk about the game, and really it comes down to the fact that it looks great. The thing is, while it may not seem that way on the surface, sports games are, from what I can tell at least, one of the more difficult genres to work on. The truncated development schedules, which require annual entries in each series, mean less time between each release, but there's more to it than that. You see, everyone knows what sports look like. Well, mostly everyone. I mean, you've almost certainly seen a game of basketball or football on television, right? So a game like NBA 2K21 needs to deal with the fact that you have real people in real places performing complex interlinking actions. If you're off by even just a hair, you're diving straight into the uncanny valley. So what is it that makes this so challenging then? Well, first of all, you have to nail down the arenas and player likenesses. This is a huge part of the equation, but from my perspective, it's more about the motion or animation. Realistic animation, momentum, and collision of each player on a court is a huge challenge. There's still plenty of innovation happening in terms of animation work in games, of course, but it's the need for close interaction between each player that makes sports games so much more difficult, I think, than any other genre out there. In that sense, Visual Concepts is doing great work overall. It's easy enough to spot the imperfections in the visuals, sure, but if you just let the game kind of wash over you, it really does begin to look surprisingly authentic in action. Alright, but let's get into some of the visual details. Now, I don't know that much about the sport to be honest, but even still, let's highlight some of the areas where I feel the game shines, and that begins with the players. 2K21 includes a vast roster of players from current NBA athletes to legends from the past. By and large, the quality of the rendering of each player is of exceptionally high quality. The models themselves are intricately detailed with realistic skin shading, sweat, and facial expressions. Players look around the court and react to plays in real time. It's not perfect, and there is a hint of the dead eye effect here, but it's solid. As with the last generation versions, 2K21 also uses a cloth simulation for uniforms. As you move around the court, the cloth reacts to each animation in a very realistic fashion. But really, the big question here is, what does the new next-gen version of 2K21 bring to the table over, say, PlayStation 4 and Xbox One when it comes to character rendering? Well, the most significant change here lies in materials, shading, and lighting. Primarily based on the side-by-side comparison shots I've made here, the skin receives a significant boost to its specular layer, allowing the surrounding lighting to play more realistically off its surface. Players just appear more natural this time around as a result of this change. This is at the start of a game, by the way, before the sweat kicks in, but LeBron looks completely flat here on PlayStation 4, even though the model is actually of similar geometric detail. If we dive into the past then, the improved materials and skin shading really help Michael Jordan look more natural here. And the same of course goes for Scottie Pippen.
Welcome to the city, the slams with no pity. I hope you're ready.
Now if we jump over to Shaq, you can see that the PS4 has a specular layer, but it's simplified in comparison to the PS5 version. And this really is the key here. The way light plays off the skin above all else really helps bring the players to life. But of course there's other details as well, like these occlusion shadows. Note the ambient shadowing from Shaq's arm here on PS5 versus that on PS4. This is also evident here during this pre-match segment. Look at the area where his tie and coat intersect. Subtle shadowing really brings extra depth to the PS5 version, while the materials and lighting feel more realistic all around. It makes for a really interesting comparison too, as it really highlights just how important these elements truly are. I mean, the characters are of similar quality really, but they do look so much better in the latest version of the game. Now you'll also see various characters featured during this game's story sequences. There's this single player narrative centered around a high school kid and his rise in the world of the NBA. Here the rendering feels slightly less impressive, as it's something you can compare to other story-driven games. Without the background of the court, the flaws just become more evident, primarily the eyes, one of the most difficult things to get right. Still, even with this, the characters look really good overall. At a glance, the difference may not seem that massive compared to the last gen, but the changes all work in tandem to deliver more realistic looking players. Before we move on to the courts though, we should talk about the sweat. Basically, as you play, the players work up a sweat, and by the end of the game, they're soaked in it. Now, we've seen this before, going all the way back to games like Fight Night Round 3 on 360, and heck, maybe even earlier, but the quality of this is really exceptional in NBA 2K21, and a big step up over what was visible on the last gen version. The specularity of the skin and sweat heightens realism all around, and the players look great. The same is true of the courts, which receive new materials as well, producing more realistic results once again. The color and material response is simply more natural in the next gen version of the game. But really, one of the biggest draws for me here is the crowd. Like I said at the beginning and multiple times now, I haven't really paid close attention to sports games in recent years, so I kind of missed the rise in crowd quality, but it really hits home here, even on last gen. The amount of detail present in each member of the crowd is remarkably impressive. They have individual fingers while all moving somewhat independently. Yeah, if you look too closely in the replay mode, you can spot dead eyes galore, clipping issues and more, but honestly, it works really well during gameplay, and these small flaws are actually kind of funny. Then there's the reflections in the court itself, and this is an area where tried and true seems to win the day. Based on what I can tell at least, I believe the game is using planar reflections as opposed to ray traced or screen space reflections. Planar reflections are still rather useful when applied to a single, plane such as this court, but they're far less flexible in a more complex game world, and they're still demanding, so we don't see them too often these days. In this case, the reflection seems to be altered by shaders used on the wood floors to properly distort what you see. The quality and resolution of the reflections seem to be improved on next gen versus last. It's even more convincing and realistic now. The nature of planar reflections also means that objects can be perfectly duplicated and reflections can intersect without issue. There's no SSR artifacts here. The backboard also receives mirror-like reflections which show both the hoop itself and the ball, while the net receives nice physics as you jam it in. None of these features are new to the next-gen version, mind you, but they're more refined overall. Speaking of refinement, the upgraded version of 2K21 receives some serious improvement to the overall user experience. Firstly, the entire user interface has been completely overhauled. It's entirely unique to the next-gen version of the game. The high-speed storage allows for a more dynamic team selection screen since it's possible to rapidly load in new characters, I'd imagine. It's a big upgrade, and this applies to just about every facet of the user experience. But there's a lot more to the storage situation here. Okay, so first of all, this is PS4 Pro, right? Getting into a match requires a loading screen, much like this. It's not that long, mind you, but you will be waiting between the main menu and the game. This is how sports games have worked for a long time, at least since the dawn of the CD-ROM. Now on next-gen systems, it's basically instant. That's right, you get this simple video animation that plays once you launch into the game, but you transition directly to the pre-game events. It's so fast that any and all waiting is basically eliminated. I don't even need to use a timer here, as you can plainly see the results in action. It really is that fast. More than anything else, I think this is one of the biggest game changers for this title. It makes getting in and out of the game and adjusting things so much more seamless. I really like this improvement. And there's even more than this, like the city mode, which allows you to roam around an open environment among other things. There's just a ton of features packed in this game, and it's an impressive effort all around from the development team. Honestly, with these comparisons, I've kind of only just scratched the surface of what's really here, but I feel this is a good primer on what you can expect from the new version of the game, at least visually. So I guess the remaining question here then is, how does it stack up on PS5, Xbox Series X, and of course the Xbox Series S? Well, the good news is that they are virtually identical from a visual perspective. Both PS5 and Series X deliver a full native 4K presentation. It looks super sharp on both systems, and all visuals appear the same between them. The PS4 Pro version, which I used for the last gen comparisons, by the way, also seems to run at native 4K, but with the obvious reduction in visual fidelity. Now, the one outlier here, predictably, is the Series S version. This one runs at a native 1080p rather than 4K, or 1440p. You get the same visuals as its bigger brother. Usually anyway, sometimes like the scene before it's missing depth of field, but in other scenes it's there. But it's all presented at a lower resolution, and this also applies to the user interface, by the way. Still, this is an excellent multi-platform effort that offers everyone a great presentation with fast loading. Which brings us to the next part of the equation, and that is performance, which thankfully is also rather cut and dried, with one strange exception, which I'll discuss in a moment. Now, it is worth noting that all versions use a mixed frame rate mode. Basically, gameplay operates at 60 frames per second, while replays and interstitial scenes update at 30 frames per second. As best as I can tell, this is pretty much how basketball games in general have functioned for years, so it's not really surprising. One nice update for next generation though is the addition of per object motion blur, which you can easily spot during 30 FPS sequences. There's a slider you can adjust if you really don't like it, but I feel it really helps smooth out these 30 FPS scenes. But okay, let's get to the performance, starting with Xbox Series X first, using the default camera position. You get a nice, perfect 60 frames per second experience, with drops to 30 during the cuts. Well, mostly perfect at least. I did notice these occasional single frame drops here and there, but honestly overall it's solid. Thankfully, if you're on PS5, it offers the same smooth 60 FPS gameplay experience with those same 30 FPS interstitial scenes. Again, it perfectly nails the target as you play. Another good showing, and ever so slightly faster than the Xbox Series X version, as there are no rogue frame drops. So thus far, we're 2 for 2, right? Well, what about Series S? Thankfully, the drop in resolution pays dividends because the Series S also offers the same 60-30 split. Gameplay is buttery smooth, exactly as it should be. So yeah, at this point, I thought it was pretty cut and dried. All versions are hitting 60 FPS during gameplay, and it feels great to play. But I ran into this one strange little thing. Basically, to add visual variety to this video, I often switched the game camera around to provide unique angles. During one match, I swapped to the parametric camera on Series X, and noticed this. There are minor frame rate dips that occur on the Series X when using the parametric camera with the lower angle. This seems to pop up specifically when the camera has a full view of the court and arena, or when the transparent hoop is in view. So of course I tested the same scene on PlayStation 5 using the exact same teams and the exact same camera configuration, and as you can see, the problem did not appear. It is a locked 60 frames per second. Okay, so what about Series S? Well, this actually fares a little better than Series X, but it's not 100% perfect. I still noted some minor dips here. Based on the way it occurs then, I can conclude that this is likely some sort of GPU related drop. Thankfully, this is easily avoided by using alternative camera angles. It really is just an academic difference really, as this angle isn't the best for actual gameplay. It's just data though, so there you go. Still, honestly, the news is overwhelmingly great for this game, and fans can expect smooth performance wherever they choose to play. It's just ever so slightly more performant on the PS5. So, what's the takeaway here? Well, truth be told, this experience was a lot more impressive than I had anticipated. While the limitations in the animation system are certainly evident at points, it's a lot more fluid and realistic looking than any other basketball game I've seen. Visual Concepts has set a high bar here when it comes to visual quality, and this is really just the beginning, I suppose. It's nice to see that this version seems to be completely separate from the last generation iteration, suggesting that they're building from this new starting point. I expect we'll continue to see things improve over time. As for the game itself, well, it was certainly an interesting experience. As someone that has not touched a sports video game for a very long time, I had a lot of fun actually. Now for the video, I did lean heavily on the AI for capturing to produce the best looking footage, but I also spent a lot of time playing, and it does manage to play rather well. It's certainly no NBA Jam, I mean, what is, but it's intuitive enough and it's a lot of fun. Plus it has these street ball modes with 2-on-2 or other alternative options if you like. Honestly, it feels like I've just barely scratched the surface of the overall package here, and did not even run into any of the microtransactions which I've heard so much about. So yeah, as the first sports game I've covered, I've had a remarkably fun time making this video, and I hope you enjoyed the comparison as well. If you want to see more sports games covered here on Digital Foundry, from someone that knows nothing about sports at least, be sure to let us know. And in the meantime, if you like this video, give us a like, subscribe, ring that notification bell, and all that good stuff. And if you want a 4K high quality version of it, you can find that over on our Patreon. But until next time, this is John, signing off.
Don't lose players to game errors and crashes. Instability will happen throughout the game development cycle during playtesting, beta cycles, or after you've released. Backtrace was developed to automate the capture and analysis of crashes, hangs, and non-fatal errors across PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo, PC, Mac, Stadia, and more. Our unique data platform allows you to index anything, integrate with Jira, Slack, Discord, and run analytic workloads to better prioritize and understand your game stability. Many of the industry's AAA studios depend on Backtrace. You should too. Click on the link in the video description and sign up for your free trial today.